All right, to continue with what we were talking about. There we are, that first early integrated circuit, or at least one of the first, being able to wire everything together to create the circuits, to create the transistors, put it all on one integrated circuit. And then, of course, what we come to now, just to remind you. And then the fact that NASA started using it, and Minuteman missiles, places where they had the money to spend, right? And then the fact that because you can actually print so many of these, right? The price in 10 years goes from 10 transistors costing 1,000 to machines that had 1,000 transistors and only cost 7 or 6 cents. Wow. And then today's current integrated circuits that we call like a processor. I'm going to buy a processor or a CPU for my computer that has more than 700 million transistors. As a matter of fact, I think Apple's M1 is like 16 billion transistors. And roughly, right? Roughly what you're saying is the more transistors, the more computing power I have, roughly. So by the 1970s, you end up with all that stuff sitting on the shelves and nothing being built. I don't know any other time in history, and I'm not a huge historian, but I don't know any other real big time in history where basically you got the components to build something just sitting around. That'd be like saying that nobody had really made a car engine, but all the components are sitting there. All they got to do is put them together. That's what's going on. Kind of like saying trucks were used in government, but nobody had their personal car until people started building them themselves, right? That's what happened with computers. Instead, you end up with the hobbyist that comes in and really understands what a computer does and wants one for themselves. And so you see this written all sorts of ways, and in history, they tend to boil things down way too far. So they tend to use Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, Bill Gates, and Paul Allen as the only persons in the world that were doing any of this. And that wasn't the case. There was hundreds and hundreds across the United States in particular, because the technology was being built there in California. And, you know, not to get into it too deep, you couldn't just send those kinds of things across the ocean. The government didn't want you doing that kind of thing. It was a trade secret. Anyway, so really what happens, right, is it comes down to these types of people. In the 70s, Bill Gates and Paul Allen are in high school, private school, all right? So people that invented the computer, most of them, the vast majority of them, were kids that went to private schools or schools that had a lot of money from donators that gave them a ton of money. And they had the chance to use computers, right? Now, computers are these huge things. So for Paul Allen and Bill Gates, it's not at their school. What they got to do was they had access to the city mini computer. So we're not talking about a massive mainframe, but one that would, you know, fit within my office at work, basically. And they got a terminal that would be tied into it on their campus, and they could do programs. They could program. So probably, I don't think this has ever been researched, but you know, Bill Gates started at the age of 13. He was probably the youngest software engineer that existed at the time, and he was a genius at it. He really was. And he was using these computers. So it makes sense that somebody that's used a machine that, you know, maybe costs $25,000, they can't go and just spend money on that, are the ones that take a look at these parts that are sitting on shelves and say, couldn't I just, you know, put those together and make a smaller one? It's sure it won't be as powerful as the one that the government has, but then I'd have a computer that did what I wanted, right? So a lot during that time, tons of people were forming these computer electronic clubs, and they were building things with these chips, basically building computers. Radio Shack was a big deal. Steve Wozniak actually showed off basically the first Apple computer in 1975. In 1973, Wozniak, 2 years earlier, had helped a friend, Steve Jobs, at his job at Atari. So you recognize that name. You know, what is Atari doing? They're building these, right? So this is an Atari game. This is an Atari game, Asteroids. So they were building those, and they were the pioneers in that field. Atari was. They're building some games, and basically they wanted, or had been, getting ready to Breakout, getting ready to introduce this game called Breakout, which is famous now. I mean, there's so variations now, Arkanoid, stuff like that is made from the same kind of thing. The problem is that they needed to be able to make more money off of it. And so they told Steve Jobs, one thing that you'll read about Steve Jobs a lot is that he was a big promiser. You bet, I can do that. Very optimistic person. And the truth is that he couldn't do what they were asking him to do, but thank goodness he knew the was, and that's what he's known as, the was. So he actually asked the was, hey, can you help me? Because you're a lot better with this. Kind of show me. So it's not like, hey, was, do my job for me. That's not what it was. It's like, was, show me how to do this. So what you have to understand is, even if you don't like Steve Jobs or don't know what he is, he was a genius in his own right, and he could understand what Woz was doing. So what Woz did at this time is he reduced the number of chips needed to build this Breakout game by 50, right? So maybe, I don't know how many was in there, you can read up on it, but maybe there's 100 chips in there. You just basically cut it in half. When you do that, now you basically have reduced your cost, not by half because there's other components, but by a lot, right? What he did was so ahead of his time. The way he understood electronics and how it could fit together and what you could do was amazing. He was one of the first inventors of the floppy drive. Anyway, I'll go on because I'll have a video on him in there. So with Woz's genius and Jobs' vision, that would later come to the Apple computer, which was just simply a board that you had to build the rest of your computer off of. So in 1976, they released this. So remember, he's working in 1973 at Atari, or helping Steve Jobs with Atari. They actually released a full computer, the Apple II, in late 1977, like October, November, December of 1977. Why was Jobs important to this, as I get into more in a different video? Because he really understood what was happening and how important it was. Where Wozniak was like, I want a computer. So he was like, here's the engineering genius, here's the genius that figured out this is how the world's going to use them, and we need to be in on that. All right, so again, Pong, that Atari sold, it was like a single system, so I could pull it up, but it's just a little tiny box that has some controllers, and you plug it in your TV and it plays one game called Pong. They were selling that in 1972. I combine this because, to me, they're computer systems. Yes, gaming systems are much more limited, but they're still computer systems. And it gives you kind of a time frame of basically saying, well, the first computers start getting released in 1976 and 77, and people are already doing video games in 72. And they're doing the big ones, and they start to do ones that you plug into your TV. So then we get to the one that becomes the most famous, which is the Atari 2600. But it was originally called the Atari VCS, Video Computer System. And this is where you put the cartridge in. That's what we call them. But I don't know if I have another picture, but it shows that it'll say combat program, tic-tac-toe program. So basically what you're doing is, this is a computer and you're just shoving these programs in to do certain things. A lot of these game systems will would have keyboard attachments, so you can use them as a computer, all sorts of stuff. This is some of the awesome graphics that we experienced back in the day. Right, this was not the arcade one, this was your game at home. So the PC becomes the platform for home and play. That's this next section. Right, so there was one business executive who had an idea of what a personal computer might mean to the general public. This was in the same year that Atari got into the home video game system in 1975. So again, they're making stand-ups, but then in 1975, now we're going to get into the home game system. This company was called MOS Technologies, or Metal Oxide Semiconductor Technologies. So for us, that's like, what does that mean and who cares? But for somebody who needs to buy a metal oxide semiconductor, they know what that means, right? So they started to produce an IC, an integrated circuit known as the 6502. So we're going to look at who that man was. You have a whole thing on him. But basically, it was an 8-bit chip That's what it did, and it ran at 1 megahertz to 2 megahertz. Now, in case you're not aware, our systems run between 2 gigahertz to 4 gigahertz. Giga, so that's 1,000 more. This is a mega, right? So this would be like a 0.2 gigahertz. This is what it would be. Okay, so anyway, MOS technology, the corporation was created by Alan Bradley, who actually the main character in Tron was named Alan Bradley. And they made it in 1969 to combat the monopoly of Texas Instruments held on the electronic calculator market. So what predates computers? Calculators. So I don't know exactly where Texas Instruments fits in. I've looked at it a couple of times, but have never filed it away in my memory. But basically, you know, you've got Jack Kilby, who ends up creating Intel, and Fairchild Semiconductor continues to go on, and along comes Texas Instruments in Texas, right? And they fill a need. They come out and say, hey, why not make a small computer that is literally just a computer? In other words, it does calculations. It's a calculator. That's what they end up calling that. As you can imagine, I don't know if you're aware of this, but back then, kids that when they went to school, once they got in advanced math classes, they had to use slide rules, which, you know, you look one of those up and see how they work, but it's nowhere near the power of a calculator. It's very analog. And so they fill a need, and they just own that market. They're creating integrated circuits for the purpose of calculators. Well, of course, MOS technology, they come into business basically to say, hey, there shouldn't be just one maker of this, right? We can make these too. And we'll get into the person that does this, but basically what happens is as the processors are becoming more powerful, they realize there's other things we can do with this. And that's how the 6502 is born. It's like, we can do more than just building something that goes 4 plus 4. We can make these do much, much more. Well, something that was happening is that this CEO of Commodore, this company called Commodore, his name was Jack Tramiel, and again, there's a video for him. And he purchases MOS technology because basically Texas Instruments starts selling chips more expensively to him. So he's making really good calculators, and he's starting to cut into Texas Instruments business. And since they're the ones that make the chip, they go, oh yeah, we'll still sell those to you. The new price is, right, there's no way he can make a calculator to compete because he can't get the components cheap enough. So he goes and buys MOS technologies. That's what he does. And this is the MOS 6502 CPU that was produced for a very long time. And you'll see why I'm talking about this in just a minute. So hold on with me. So there's a guy named Chuck Peddle, and he's the one that designed that 6502. He's the one that really looked and said, why are we just making a calculator? What if we could do this, 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 and this? And he designs this processor. Well, when Jack Tramiel takes over, he basically, one of the things that people didn't like about him is that he would basically bring you in front of him and say, justify your position to me. So Chuck Peddle shoots the moon, right? He goes in and says, look, why are we just making calculators? I get this processor, and I think the future is in these computing devices that do much more. So they produced a single board in 1976. That sounds familiar. It was the first all-in-one computer containing a computer itself, a monitor, a keyboard, and they sold that one in 1977. And the Apple II was sold a little later that year. So this right here was the first all-in-one computer. They actually understood that concept from a long time ago. If I'm going to buy the thing, why should I buy the computer, then buy the monitor, then buy? Let's include it all in one housing. And these are really expensive now. This is actually one of the first computers I ever worked on in my life. And they made this neat little chirping sound when they start up. I need to make that a ringtone. And they looked very futuristic. I mean, even now it's kind of like, that's a retro future look to it. They had a lot of style to it. But in any case, that's when they released it. They released just prior to the Apple II that year. It was a lot cheaper than the Apple II, and we get into more of that later. So by the 1980s, a fierce battle in the home education market was underway. And in 1982, Commodore released the much upgraded computer that had color and sound called the Commodore 64. And back then, the number stood for something. They wanted people to know what that was. So it was 64K of RAM, 64,000 bytes of RAM. That's incredible, right? Anyway, Commodore sold more than 19 million units, and there's always people arguing about how many millions of units they sold. Doesn't matter. 6 million, 19 million, wow. They sold a ton of them. In comparison, right, cost less than half. Apple computer, they sold Apple II models 1.25 million, right? So this Commodore 64 was by far the best-selling machine of all time, the single unit of all time. And I've included some ads so you can kind of see some of the stuff from back then of how they advertised it. And these were all the hobbyists, right? We're still dealing with hobbyists. We're still dealing with people, home buyers, people that were really up on tech and had a small business. That's who you're dealing with. Massive businesses still have these massive mainframes or mini computers, and we'll look at a mini computer later, but they were expensive. They were hugely expensive. This was filling that need of people at home saying, I want to use that. That's really cool. And people in small businesses going, isn't there a way for me to manage my business? I don't have to buy a mini computer that costs $25,000, right? Now, I highlighted this because this is why I talk about the 6502. It was a revolutionary piece of equipment that happened. It was in the Apple II. And no, Jack Tramiel did not do what Texas Instruments did to him. He sold it to the Apple II and made sure there was enough for the Commodore PET, the Commodore CBM, the BBC Micro, the Atari 2600 that we just looked at, the Atari 800, Commodore VIC-20, 64, Nintendo NES. Everybody should remember that one, right? Ohio Scientific, Tamagotchi Digital PET, so many years later. That chip was used for 2 decades, for 20, 25 years, and all of these products that really had a fundamental change to our society. And that came from this guy, Chuck Peddle, that you look at in more detail. All right, so I'm going to stop here and then we'll take a look at the business use.